Careful.
I went crazy and didn't do $10 bets. I went $15 bets. Yeah.
Oh, that's too rich for my blood.
The minimum's 10.
I was playing low stakes limit poker. Yeah.
Oh.
No, I don't want to lose my house. I don't even have one.
Hey guys, it's Emma Vigeland with TYT Politics and John Adirola from the Young Turks and just general life. We have one
I
mic.
exist in general life.
You
yeah.
do. You're not a hologram of sorts.
No. We don't have that technology yet.
Yeah, but soon. So we're here at the DNC Unity Reform Commission. They're running a little bit late, so sorry to keep you guys waiting. But I gave this overview on TYT Politics. Essentially, they're going to be talking about the primary process, how to make it better. This is a panel of 21 people. The chair is a Hillary Clinton person. The vice chair is a Bernie Sanders person, the head of Our Revolution. And then there is 9 Hillary Clinton people, 7 Bernie Sanders people, and 3 DNC chair appointees on this commission. Nomiki Konst, our very own, is one of the people on there. And so we just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a preview. We expect that it'll be some interesting discussions, some back and forth on how to reform the primary process. Yeah.
So do you want me to hold this, by the way? I don't want your arm to get tired.
I'm weak.
So this is the first of these sorts of meetings that I've gone to. Each of the meetings obviously has been on a different area of focus, of which they have several. And I know that a lot of our fans have a number of different big concerns, areas of reform that they'd like to see. In this particular meeting, some of those areas are not going to be discussed, or if they are discussed, it's going to be somewhat tangentially. Like, there's not going to be a lot of focus on the superdelegate process. Some of the larger reforms specific to the internal functioning of the Democratic Party are not going to have a lot of discussion, unfortunately. After the meeting, when we hopefully will be able to interview some of the commission members, we can bring up those topics. But yeah, it is going to be focused specifically on primaries, which isn't ideal. I don't know how much is going to get accomplished, but it is obviously very important, and people had massive problems with the way the primaries were run last time.
Yeah, and also not even specifically about caucuses. I guess there are 3 areas of reform that are being discussed in the Unity Reform Commission. One is primaries/caucuses. Only primaries are being discussed today. Then is the
I feel like you could do both.
Yeah, I mean, the caucuses are primaries, but just like weird and horrible.
Well, but also, like, it's not necessarily the largest concern with the primaries. There are others, but whether you have them or caucuses is a concern. So how are you going to talk for 4 hours about primaries? Nobody can bring up caucuses. Don't even talk about it.
Right.
But that's one of the alternatives that we could turn to.
There
could. That's the area that they're most likely to touch on, I think. Like, I could see Nomi bringing that up or something like that. But it seems like an odd omission. Like, that is an integral part of the discussion about how the primaries should be reformed for the next cycle.
Right. And I think, really, I would say most of our concern is open primaries. What we want is to see the primary process open up. You see in New York, I mean, the deadline...
Speak for yourself. I want one person voting in each primary, carefully chosen by the party leadership.
Right. We want essentially a republic, but like an intergalactic Star Wars kind of republic where bureaucracy only exists.
I like where you're going with this.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah. So I think that opening the primary process is my chief concern. I live in New York City. I know how difficult it is to be a Democratic voter there. It's so closed off. And we even see that they're already trying to reform the California primary process early on in anticipation of 2020.
Yeah.
So hopefully there are some people, some Hillary, some DNC people that will swing over to that side and say, hey, we're the Democratic Party with the big D, maybe we should be small d, Democratic, and open up the process to as many people as possible.
Yeah. Maybe for once we can have a big D. Damn it. But yeah, I would like to see, I mean, obviously there's, the openness is a big thing. I don't know what argument could still remain after the last cycle that it's better to close people off. Why would you want people getting interested and involved in your party months ahead of an election? You should just scramble at the last minute to get them to vote for you. That doesn't seem like a winning argument anymore. But then also you have, how the openness in terms of when you can register and all that. And one of my frustrations back during the Obama years was the inability or the unwillingness of the Democratic Party to open up the federal election day, to enshrine that as one of the most important holidays, to make sure that everybody can go, that they don't have to take time off of their 1, 2, or 3 jobs to go. And I was wondering, why didn't they ever get to this, like a national voting day, democracy day? But then you see how they run the primaries and the willingness of many of the members to limit how many people get involved, and the commitment to actually getting people involved and voting. It's incredibly weak, and it's obviously hurting the party. in the primaries and in the general election.
Well, again, they also don't practice what they preach in terms of transparency. So we're supposed to be better than the Republican Party or the Democratic Party is, but there's a lot of money in these parties, consultant money, where people don't know where it's going. It's not going down to state parties. What we'll touch on later is that the 50-state strategy was employed by Howard Dean in 2006, and that was very successful. And then the Obama people kind of came in. OFA was run parallel to the DNC, sapped a lot of the resources from the DNC, and made it all about the presidential election. What I hope the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, and of course the rest of the panel, talks about is how can we make state primaries more competitive, or how can we make state elections more competitive? I know this is just about primaries, by giving more resources to them beyond the presidential election, because hey, while President Obama was in office, we lost so many seats, and that's what's terrifying about it.
Yeah, and I think especially those who were around for the Howard Dean years and the switch to more of a concern about the entire country, like, I don't think that there is an argument to go away from that, to continue on this whole just focusing on the presidential thing. But if there was an argument, you better fucking win the presidential election. If you can't even do that, clearly your strategy is both philosophically, I would say, opposed to some of the values that go into the Democratic Party, but also just stupid. It doesn't work. You could have gotten so much more bang for your buck at the state level, at the local level. You chose not to do that, and you still lost. But we know that not everybody lost. Sure, Hillary Clinton lost, the party technically lost, but the money was still spent, and the people who got to spend it still have the nice cars.
Exactly.
I mean, they may shed a couple of tears because Donald Trump is the president, but they're shedding them inside of their nice house.
Well, that's what it really all comes down to, is the consultant takeover of the Democratic Party, which is rich consultants who are invested in keeping things as they are and getting the money and getting their payday as they are. And it doesn't really matter if the Democratic Party doesn't win, if progressive ideas don't win and the country falls apart, but they still get their short-term payoff. And I think that's really what's underlying in terms of the tension between the Bernie wing, the grassroots wing. You'll hear them say grassroots, that really means the Bernie Sanders wing, it's kind of synonymous, and the more establishment people in the party. I mean, just looking at it's not all bad. They're trying to unify and come together, but with more establishment people being, there's 3 DNC members and 9 Hillary Clinton people versus 7 Bernie Sanders people, it's an uphill battle, if I'm being honest with you guys, in terms of overall major reform. But hopefully we'll see engagement from the audience. Here today, we have some TYT fans, engagement from the general populace to say, hey, this isn't right.
Yeah, and so numerically, if you believe that it's unlikely that much will come out of this, you've got the numbers to back that up. Your fear has some grounding numerically. But maybe I'm naive still at this advanced stage, but I do think, there's a significant number of people on the Bernie side, and then there's got to be a few people that, after the experience of this last election, you've got to acknowledge that changes need to be made. And a lot of them have been corrupted by how long they've been invested in the system. A lot of them are or know these consultants, so some of them will be unreachable. But I mean, we all can look back on this experience, and whether you were on the Bernie side or the Hillary side, the primary process sucked, the general election process sucked. Nobody wants to go through that again. Pragmatically, they should know that you had better make deeper than surface level reforms if you want to keep your jobs, or if you want to have any chance of actually winning elections. Again, as we said before, that's not everybody's prime concern, unfortunately, even though it seems like it should be. But I do have hope that we'll be able to swing them on a couple of important things. The superdelegates have just got to go. I think that everybody knows that. Not everybody will vote for that, but that's the area where I hope that there's big reform and openness of primaries as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, superdelegates are undemocratic. That's just the way of the world. And I know why they were put in place when they initially were historically, but now we have the public transparency and the internet to allow for an engaged populace that can pick someone, hopefully, who isn't crazy and who actually can represent them. I was hoping that we would be able to start on time, but apparently we're just still waiting on them. Yeah. Apparently they're having a heated debate behind the scenes that we're not knowing about. But
yeah, and so that's one of the things. I mean, this whole process is the opposite of transparent. I mean, that's one of the reasons we're doing this this live streaming, even though it's super inside baseball. If you want to take a short nap in the middle, I won't be mad at you for that. But it's important that people have access to this if they want it. But there's still, even outside of this thing, there's so much that we don't see. Like the meeting that's going on right now. They're doing their working groups, and from what we've heard from the inside, that's where a lot of the actual work is going to get done. We're not allowed to film that. We don't necessarily know what's coming out of that. I don't see any written documentation coming out of it. And people need to know what is the entire process has to be followed. We can't simply start paying attention in the end of December, early January when the actual votes are happening. Then it might be too late to actually put pressure on people. We need to know where people stand on the issues month by month so we can exert pressure, make sure that they know what the stakes are, what the consequences are if they refuse to support some of the extremely popular reforms that we've been discussing.
And also, I want to say that you may hear this argument on Twitter, and maybe hear even an identity politics argument that's saying that the Bernie wing of the party doesn't want to support the young black, Latino, or women voters and faction of the party. And I think that's a particularly insidious kind of way to go about criticisms of the leftist, the populist wing of the party, because it's co-opted racism, which is a real problem in this country, sexism, real problem in this country, to deflect from substantive systemic reform. Yeah. And that's, from what I've heard on the inside, that is an argument that has been made and that may continue to be made. And I find that frustrating because it deflects from real discussions about racism and problems systemically, in addition to what's going on in the Democratic Party. Yeah, and I mean, especially for those of you who were Bernie Sanders supporters during that, all of you have gotten, you've seen the tweets, you've seen the articles about, you may think that you're a woman. You may think that you're non-white, but you're not. You're a Bernie bro. You're a white male, damn it. I don't care what you think you've been your whole life. That's the experience, and I actually am, so I guess they're right in my case, but you're not quite. So everybody's experienced that. Not quite. Everybody's experienced that, obviously. But if you actually, the data is out there, go look at the demographics of who supported Bernie Sanders and who supported Hillary Clinton, and especially amongst 18 to 35-year-olds, they could not be more wrong about the diversity of that group, gender-wise, racially, all of that. So this narrative, man, it was such a successful narrative that continues to this day, including, maybe at some point we'll talk about that press release that came out of the Women's Convention. They just keep on with that argument that Bernie Sanders has a very particular type of supporter, and that's true, but it's not white males, it's progressives, it's young people, it's a lot of things. And they make that argument based on his lack of support in the South by African American men and women, especially women, but that's really based on the party politics of the South. I don't think it has much to do with him being a racist. Actually, it has nothing to do with him being a racist, but that's an argument that they continue to make. We're seeing people shuffle in right now, so I think we might back out right now. Idea, yeah. We're probably going to go hang tight, see if someone is walking in front of the camera. So
we've bugged a couple of areas of the table. Hopefully we'll pick up some of their private conversations. I'm joking. We unfortunately don't have that. But we are going to be live streaming this. Stay engaged is extremely important, even if it's a little bit dry at times. And hopefully there will be a few fireworks. We're hoping anyway.
And we did just see Nomiki Konst. Do you guys know who that is? And very own Nina Turner walk in. So two pretty legendary people, I must say, so if I say so myself. But yeah, we're live, so we're going to sign off. Enjoy, guys. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching.
I guess they're still watching.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry that we are starting a little bit late, but thank you all for being here. I am Jen O'Malley Dillon, and I serve as the chair of the Unity Reform Commission, and I'm joined by my great friend and vice chair, Larry Cohen, and I hereby call this meeting of the Unity Reform Commission to order. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you all to join me in a moment of silence to honor those victims that have been involved in the recent tragic events here in the city of Las Vegas. Our thoughts and prayers are with their families, the city, and the first responders and all that are working through what's happened here, and we're certainly proud to be in such a great city for our meeting today. I'd like to now ask the members and all of you to join us for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I am now going to ask Patrice Taylor to call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. O'Malley Dillon?
Present.
Mr. Cohen?
Yes.
Mr. Baker? Ms. Bauer? Mr. Berman? Ms. Flores? Congresswoman Fudge? Yes. Ms. Harris? Mr. Wynn? Ms. Kmark? Here. Ms. Klebb? Here. Ms. Konst? Here. Ms. Lewis? Mr. Newport? Mr. Neary? Here. Mr. Roosevelt?
Here.
Ms. Ruiz? Here. Ms. Turner? Here. Mr. Weaver? Here. Mr. Webb? Here. And Mr. Zogby? Here. Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Great, thanks, Patrice. And thank you all for being here. I want to just make a special note about Mayor Newport, who was not able to join us here today. He's in California, and obviously, like so many others, affected by the fires. And so we sent him our good wishes, but appreciate having so many of our commission members here. So let us get started. Again, sorry that we are starting a bit late today, but we are so excited to see all of you in the room. We are on our fourth meeting of the Unity Reform Commission that has taken us all across the country. And it has been wonderful at each place to see so much involvement from the local community where we're having the meeting. Certainly this is a special meeting for us in that it takes place alongside other meetings of the National Party and the state party chairs, and so we'd like to welcome all the DNC members, state party folks, all of the local Las Vegas state party folks that are here with us today, and especially activists and grassroots members of our community that are here to listen and be part of all of this. We are here, all of us, coming from different places, but here because we believe in this party. We believe in all of you and the importance of your role and the grassroots role within our party, and so it's wonderful to have so many people here joining us today. So, as I mentioned, this is our fourth meeting. We have had a series of really important discussions over the past year that have involved experts, that have involved discussions that allow us to better understand what's currently happening, whether it's talking about what's going on in local states to what's happening at the National Party, and we are in the latter stages of what this commission's being asked to do. So this meeting is an important one for us, and we are spending a lot of time really trying to hone in on the key elements of the mandate that this commission has and working together. I think we've spent some time this morning, and I think something that really is critical for all of our work is this is about unity and reform. And I think that every single member of this commission takes that very seriously and has done so throughout the year, but also we all know how important it is to ensure that our work has real impact on how we move forward as a party. It doesn't take but 5 minutes, probably not even 5 minutes, to watch the news or go on your social media to see what's happening in this country and to know how many of the things that we as a party, the values we share, are at stake, and that we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. And so we are going to be and continue to be very focused and diligent on our work so that we can get done the business of sharing the values of our party, making sure the progressive movement in this country feels part of and driving who we are as a party, and that we are winning elections, because we can't afford not to. So I look forward to talking more. We'll get into the details of today and talk a little bit further. But first, I'd like to hand over the mic to Larry Cohen, who is, obviously a great leader of all the things that we believe as a progressive movement, but also as part of this commission.
Thanks, Jen. Great working with you and everyone here for the last 6 months. We have less than 2 months to go. Woo! I always do self-cheerleading. But for those who are here, as you'll see, the second part of this open meeting today, you'll get a sense of where we've been and the 4 main areas that we're going in. And all I would say is that, as Jen just said, she said it perfectly, this is about out of reform comes unity. And both words with a balance here, recognizing that in some of the worst of times politically in this country, we also get some of the best of opportunities. And many members of this commission earlier today have mentioned several of them. So out of these worst of times comes the uprising that can lead to some of the best opportunities. And our hopes collectively here are that we end up in December with very concrete things that'll go to the DNC for a vote, but also with a different kind of process about how, as Jen just said, we involve millions of more people and consistently new people. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jen, and we'll get into it.
Great, thanks, Larry. So today we have a great agenda, which is a combination of an expert speaker as well as the opportunity to hear from members of the commission. Let me just take a step back and just go through a couple of the highlights of how we think about the work. We have been mandated by the most senior body of the Democratic Party, which is the National Convention, to take up, as part of this commission, 4 specific areas. Larry has coined them as our 4 buckets, so you'll probably hear us talking about buckets a lot. But those 4 specific areas that we've been focused on are around primaries, caucuses, unpledged delegates, and party reform. And you'll see in this afternoon how we structure our discussion. Within that area, there's broad elements that we need to cover. There's also very specific things that our mandate asks us to look up and to focus on. And so we're pretty mindful of what the convention body has tasked us to do, but also have really spent a lot of time covering these issues very broadly, but also going pretty deep in them as well. We are going to use today to really go a little bit further in one particular area that we've been talking a lot about, and that's going to be the first session that we have today. We'll hear from someone from the New York Board of Elections, which will help talk through the process they have in New York State, clearly an area that has been discussed at length, and just allow us to better understand the process, what opportunities there are, and plans for adjustments there, and allow the commission to ask questions. We're then going to move into a period of time where different members of the commission who've been leading up specific subsections of work based on those 4 topics I just went through are going to go through some of the key areas that we've been focused on in our deliberations. While we've only had 4 meetings, we have been doing a lot of work, and this commission does a lot of work in between each of these meetings to keep moving the discussion forward. And part of what we want to make sure is that we are able to be as transparent as possible about the conversations and deliberations that we're having. And so the second part of this meeting will really just give everyone that's here a perspective on how we've been thinking about it, but allow additional robust discussion to take place across the commission as we work to come up with areas of recommendations and areas of greater discussion. I also want to highlight a few additional things that I want to make sure everyone's aware of. We will, after this meeting concludes, have all the commission members stay around for about 30 minutes or so here in this room to have conversations with anyone that wants to talk to them about what you've heard today, about the ideas you might have. So please feel free to stick around and make sure to take us up on that. In addition, on Friday at the exhibit hall, the Unity Commission will have a table that will be manned throughout the day, manned by commission members, and Larry is going to be the champion, and he's going for the full day coverage of the table because he loves talking about this stuff so much. But that's another opportunity for those of you that are around, whether you're DNC members or you're part of the community and you're just interested in talking further, to talk again with the commission members. There will have some paper on the table that you can fill out some of your thoughts and your contact information to follow up there. So please feel free to check that out on Friday. The final thing that I'd like to highlight is that we do have a website of the Unity Commission, and I'm going to ask Patrice to tell us what the URL is.
If you go to our homepage, democrats.org, there is a tile there that says Unity Reform Commission. You can click on the tile and it will take you to our page, which has information about the commission's mandate, and also the YouTube links to all of the past meetings, as well as a link to our survey, which we encourage you to fill out.
Right, so on that, we have a survey, and we also have, sort of an open box where people can give their thoughts. So we encourage all of you, if you have not been there before, please do go. Certainly if you've been here today and you have thoughts based on the conversations that we're having that you want to make sure is shared, please fill that in and know that we take all that information in, we're cataloging it and we're going through it, and that feedback will be part of our process as we go through our next meeting and then into the final report that we have. So with that, I want to just double check on the logistics that we're ready to go, and we can get started with our new panel, our first discussion actually today. All right, so that's on me to kick off. So we are going to have look at this, technology at its best. Love to see that work. So we are really thankful that we have our first presenter who is joining us via Skype today from New York. We are going to use this first session to have a deeper dive on party registration and affiliation and that process that takes place within New York State specifically. So joining us by Skype to walk us through how this all works, and in New York, and it seems like in a lovely library situation, is Robert Bream, who is the co-executive director of the New York Board of Elections. He has a very, very hectic and busy schedule this week in particular, and so we're very thankful that he's been willing to take the time to join us. We are going to ask him to give remarks, and then we will have a Q&A session from the commission after that. We might have to do some negotiating in terms of making sure he can hear our remarks, so we'll work through that when we get to that point. But we really thank you for joining us, and we're excited to hear from you. So I will hand the floor over to you.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join with you. You can see me, but I can't see you, but we can certainly hear you very well. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Good. We've discussed phone calls, generally New York as how we approach primary elections. We are largely a closed primary state, except we have a new reform party headed up by Curtis Sliwa, for those of you who are familiar with him. And their party rules allow non-enrolled members, non-enrolled in a political party, to vote in their primary elections for public office. The presidential primaries are only in New York. The only two parties that engage in a primary are the Democrats and the Republicans. Both of those have been closed primaries, and New York certainly has one of the earliest deadlines to change an enrollment. We have a requirement in New York State statute that a person who wishes to, from whatever they're registered as, a blank or a party, to switch to something else, that application has to be received 25 days before the November general election, and it goes into effect on the Tuesday after. So an example, last Friday, October 13th, was the 25-day deadline to change your party. It will become effective on November 14th and really will impact any election in 2018. So clearly that was an issue for people in New York State for the presidential primary. There were a number of persons who thought they were enrolled in the party who really weren't, and were frustrated by their inability to change parties. There were activists who told people to do it anyway, which created litigation through Election Day. So clearly trying to get accurate information out to people helps so that they, for those people who want to participate, they know the deadlines. I know part of your work is to make recommendations. In New York State, there are bills in the legislature that would look to reform that deadline. They've been in the consideration for a number of years. None of them have succeeded in really moving. So that clearly is something that perhaps a conversation, there might be receptive people to that approach. But we have a long history in New York of associational rights of parties. We certainly have regions of the state that are overwhelmingly one party. So there are concerns of so-called party raiding, where persons will enroll in a party simply to take over a line or an endorsement. Most recently in Westchester County, we had a large number of individuals coordinating to register in the Independence Party solely to affect a party endorsement, for a candidate for elected office. The party leaders went to court, and the judge ordered, it was the largest number, and it wasn't that many years ago, the disenrollment of 4,000 party members because they felt it was being done as a party rating issue. So it's a concern for us when you open up primaries. And we have 8 political parties in New York. The 2 with the least enrollment are the Women's Equality Party and the Reform Party, which statewide have probably less than 3,000 enrolled members. So it's very easy to take them over through a party rating if they open themselves up. But the Reform Party did that on their own. We have the Independence Party allows non-enrolled members to vote in certain primaries for statewide office. And that's been on the books for a number of years, but it's never happened yet. We have not had a contested primary where non-enrolled persons have done that. And one other, I think, anecdote we saw as a follow-up to the presidential primary, people who thought they were Democrats, and we had a similar issue with the Republicans because it was, normally by the time you get to New York, we don't have a contested Republican issue either. There were a lot of people, conservatives, who tried to vote in the Republican primary. Non-enrolled members or working family party people try to vote in the Democrat primary. And then this fall at the primary election, we had the same complaints from people. Wait a minute, I thought I was a working family. I thought I was a conservative. But the affidavit, the fail-safe ballot that they voted at the presidential primary caused their enrollment to switch to what they claimed in that affidavit. So, it's different when you come into New York from other states in that primary system where the activists for the candidates, are catching up to the rules of the state they're coming to. So we had a lot of that leading up to New York. By the time they came to us, they were encouraging their followers to who wanted to participate, certainly. But our rules just didn't allow that to happen, and their names weren't in the book. So it was a bit of a frustrating level. We had a few more affidavit ballots. We did not have a lot more court orders in that presidential primary, and we tried to look at what was the pattern. And I think the court orders are a good example, because that's an immediate instance in New York State where a voter can go before the judge pro se. They don't need a lawyer. They waive the court fees, and they can tell their plight to a judge who will either order them to vote on the machine or not to vote at all. They refuse to give the order. We did not have a large jump in the presidential primary for the court orders that were issued. We had a slight increase in the affidavit ballots because it was it was a hotly contested Democrat and it was a hotly contested Republican primary by the time they were in New York, which was a little different for us. But we did not see a larger percentage of the affidavits being valid, because when we did the research, there was no record that the person had incorrectly been omitted from the poll book. So, there are always some lessons learned. It was a harrowing experience, I think, for us and the county boards, because it was such a large number of people contacting us leading up to that presidential primary. So certainly anything we can do to improve for the next time would be helpful to all of us, the voters, the administrators, combined. Do you have questions?
Thank you. Yes, we look forward to, oh, you disappeared. There you are. Okay, great. So yeah, as you know, New York is of a lot of interest, not only because of its size. You have fusion voting, where a candidate can be on more than one of these 8 parties' ballots, which is almost unique. And you touched on a concern we have. So October 13th, last Friday, was the party registration deadline for those who are independent, for example, if they want to vote in a primary that's September 11th of 2018, the second Tuesday of September in 2018. So I think you're going to hear some conversation about that, because just as fusion voting in New York is pretty much unique, with the parties with candidate can be on more than one party, obviously you're quite aware as an expert that that kind of 11 months in advance, closure, if we want to use that word, for example, independents joining the party is also unique in our country. So again, we have huge respect for you. Don't take any of this like, we're on you. That was a great presentation, but there's a lot of concern here about, how does our party grow? How do we welcome independents? It's the #1. Non-registered voters are the largest bloc in the country. And how do we grow the party? And so there's a lot of concern about that. So we are separated here. There's 21 of us, not separated, but divided into 4 subgroups. And as Jen said earlier, one of them is primaries, and we call it conveners. We have 2 conveners of each of the 4 buckets. And so I'm going to start this off with those 2 conveners, Jeff Weaver and Charlie Baker, in terms of their comments. And I'm glad you'll be able to stick with us. I'm sure there'll be comments, there'll be questions, and we can go after Jeff and Charlie. I open it up to anyone on the commission. Just stick up your hand. I'll write it on a list and call on you in order. So Jeff, Charlie, who wants to start? They're pointing at each other here. If you can't hear us, please just raise your hand, Mr. Bream, and we will repeat the questions.
Okay.
So it's Charlie Baker. So could you just sort of walk through the difference between the date, understanding there are all these parties, which frankly is quite confusing to me, but the date what is the date that you get, if you were a member of a working families party or you're unenrolled, you would have to switch your party registration to participate in a presidential primary in New York State versus the date that if you were not registered to vote at all, you could go register?
Okay, good. I'll start with, if you're not registered at all, the deadline is you had to have residency in the political subdivision 30 days before the election, and it gives you up till 25 days before the election to submit an application. If the application is submitted in person, it's 25-day deadline. If it's postmarked 25 days, we allow up to 20 days to receive the mail and still be timely. If you are a new citizen after that deadline, and there's always a naturalization ceremony almost right up to the deadline to get up to that 10-day before the election, but you have to appear at a board in person. So that's how a person who's not registered at all. If you are registered at all, doesn't matter if you are not affiliated or affiliated, the deadline is 25 days before, so the example in 2020, it would be 25 days before the 2019 general election for that application to change your party is submitted. And then it would be, and I don't have that date, but theoretically the first, whatever, let's say it's the 7th of November, and then it would be the 14th of November, it would become effective. So, depending on when the primary and where you'd be eligible to sign a petition to be a delegate to the convention, and it depends on when New York fits into that queue. We've when they've been early, petition signature has started right around then. When it's later, it's a little bit later. So theoretically, they'd be able to enroll in time to sign a petition to qualify a candidate to be a delegate to the convention. So it is very early, certainly. One other item that I think I forgot to mention is New York has still not adopted a uniform primary date that is compliant with the Federal MOVE Act, the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. So we have a court-ordered extra primary for federal offices in June. So our ballot access in an even year starts at around early February for that federal primary. And then we have state and local in September.
Yeah, hi, this is Jeff Weaver. I just wanted to ask about a couple of points you made. First of all, you said that the Reform Party has what I would call a semi-open or semi-closed primary as opposed to a closed primary in New York?
Correct.
So is it the case that parties themselves determine whether they are open or closed as opposed to it being set by statute?
Well, the statute is a closed primary, but the court interpretation that the statute cannot impose that rule on the parties. So certainly a party rule that would allow some other group of voters to vote in that primary has been the case. And we have a state independence party. In their rule, it's for governor, comptroller, attorney general, United States senator. Any of those are contested, non-enrolled members could also vote in those primaries. And it's been on the books for 15 years, but it has never happened. Last year, there was a fight in court as to who are the officers of the Reform Party. But currently it's Curtis Sliwa, and their rules that they filed with us allow for public office any Reform voter and any non-enrolled voter to vote in their primary. So that occurred in jurisdictions across the state, including New York City, this past September.
So that's, just to clarify, so in terms of a presidential primary in New York, the state Democratic Party, by some rulemaking, could open up the primary to non-enrolled voters or non-party enrolled voters without any action by the state government. Is that right?
Well, every 4 years, the state legislature adopts rules for running the presidential primary, but they're largely dependent on the plan that you adopt at the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. So certainly, it's probably possible.
So the state, just to be clear, so the state party, without any action by the legislature, could open up its presidential primary to quote unquote independent voters?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And I just wanted to bounce off one other thing that you said. You mentioned this party rating concern, which we hear about in some places. I happen to have lived most of my life in 2 states that have no party registration at all and have never seen an effective party rating exercise occur, despite all of the concern about it. But you mentioned in your example that was with the Reform Party, which you said had a few hundred members or a few thousand members. Is there any evidence of a successful raid on the Democratic Party, some kind of statewide race on the Democratic Party in New York?
The raid most recently, the raids that have happened, it wasn't the Reform. That one was in Westchester County, was the Independence Party. In other cases, it's mostly been like the Conservative Party. It's usually the smaller parties where it's possible. I have not seen party raiding per se in a major party. But I mean, if you look in upstate New York, in the rural areas, they're more, say, Republican with fewer numbers of Democrats. So, depending on what you're talking about, opening up the primary, and in New York City, it's the opposite, largely Democrat, with fewer even Republicans or non-aligned voters. So if you open it up, you really could have a large number of people come in and vote, and the candidate is somebody who does not have any of the leanings of the party.
But you've not seen that happen.
Extremes.
You have no evidence of that happening. I mean,
That's correct.
I mean, you're articulating the concern.
So the only evidence we have is people following the rules, registering early, and in those couple of court cases, there was a proceeding and there was a finding, and they were disenrolled. But that is certainly not often, but it has happened.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Sure.
Just for the public, state your name too.
I can't hear anymore.
Try this one.
We're just working on a mic issue. 1 second.
Okay.
That one works, Jeff.
All right. Excuse me.
Come on over.
Yeah. Hi. My name is Jeff Berman. How are you? So I got a quick question. It's kind of related, but is there any reason there could not be a shorter period of time for re-registration for the presidential primary as opposed to the state level elections and primaries?
The difficulty is the overlap with the presidential primary registration deadline, and since we have the fourth Tuesday in June is the federal primary, so we are simultaneously qualifying candidates for the congressional primaries, United States Senate primaries. So I think that would be the concern if it's how can you have two different deadlines. Certainly the public policy question of does New York need a deadline that early is one that a number of people have already been working on in New York. It has not resulted in success yet. Last year, this year, our state attorney general put in a reform bill that included a change to the deadline. It was a very complicated bill. At least it was, a response to the issue.
You mentioned that the courts allow the state party, I guess through its free association rights, to determine the eligibility of the voters for their primaries, regardless of what the state statute says, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Could they also request a shorter period for re-registration based on the same rights?
It has been challenged in court, and it did not succeed. So I don't know, since we've already had that challenge. I don't know how. I can't necessarily see a successful litigation on that point. I think it's a policy question.
What did you say was already challenged? That specific question?
Yes. We've had litigation. We had litigation in the presidential primary where persons went into court on election day to try and get that ruled unconstitutional, but it had already been decided by the court, so it was not a new question. It had been, there's no new fact there. So I don't know that I don't know that the success would be to challenge that provision. I think a better success would probably be is if you can convince New York State to move the date.
Yeah, yeah. The only other thing I'll mention, I think we've talked about this in the past in the commission, is we do have a blanket rule that all steps in the delegate selection process must occur in the calendar year of the election. I guess it's arguable whether this would be one of those steps.
Yeah, I think, but I'm not sure that's a delegate selection. That's a who can vote the primary. And I'm not sure voter registration is included in your rule.
Okay.
Candidates are, and that's where I think in your national policy, the candidate need only claim to support the principles of the party. And that's why when Mr. Sanders, the issue of whether or not we would require something more from him in the last cycle, we interpreted that it was only the national chair who can disqualify him, and that since the national party had included him in all the debates, national and anti-caucuses in the United States Senate, that we were not going to, in New York, ask for anything more from Mr. Sanders unless the national chair told us he was not qualified to be the candidate. So we took the opposite approach that they meet your principles unless you, the national party, tell us otherwise.
Okay, there's 5 people in line here in the queue: Jorge, Nomi, Emmy, Elaine, and Jim. Jorge's out, so we go to Nomi.
Yeah. These are new microphones. Thank you, Mr. Bremen. I'm from New York, grew up in Buffalo, live in Queens, really frustrated with our election process. And I'm going to ask some questions that might be a little bit in the weeds in New York and may not be indicative of the rest of the country, but I think could possibly address some of these issues, hopefully. So you mentioned this New York Votes Act that Attorney General Schneiderman put forward. This is an assembly. It's not able to get through the Senate. You have a democratically elected Senate. This is a democratic state. So I think from my perspective, I'm I'm curious if if these reforms that most Democrats, because we're here representing the DNC, if most Democrats believe in these reforms in the state, then why is it not getting passed in the Senate? And number two, if it's not getting passed in the Senate and the party is able to change the rules itself, why doesn't the party just change the rules itself?
Well, I think those are two issues. I don't speak for either group, but the first issue is the party can change the rule to allow non-affiliated or I suppose you'd allow a working family, I suppose, an affiliated, to vote in their primary if they wanted to. But to change the deadline to have the name appear, so a voter who wants to say, I want to join the Democratic Party in order to vote in their primary, certainly if they had a different deadline for that, that would require a statutory change. You know, administratively, we don't have the authority to recognize that. So there's two questions. Would the party want to change their rule to allow people to vote in a primary who aren't an enrolled Democrat? That certainly is a question for them. The legislature, you know, to move the enrollment deadline has been championed by numbers of different people. We have elected a state Senate, I believe mathematically, with more Democrats than Republicans, but a group of the senators who ran on the Democrat line caucus with the Republicans. So that makes it a little bit difficult. Certainly, where there is enough interest, the legislature and the governor have passed complicated bills. So it all depends on where there's a will, there's a way.
Can I just ask one more question?
Sure.
In terms of the Democratic Party in New York State, I don't know if this is opinion or just a fact, who controls the party? Who is the leader of the Democratic Party?
Well, the state chair is Byron Brown, the mayor of your former hometown in Buffalo. And the co-chair is the former city council president in New York City. Mm-hmm. And the members of the state committee are the individual people, one male and female in each assembly district in the state of New York are members of the state committee.
So to change the rule, it would have to go through a process of voting, or would say the governor have some sort of say in this matter? Meaning Governor Cuomo.
Well, certainly when you have an elected leader in the office of the governor, it is a figurehead leader of the state Democratic Committee. You know, Basil is our executive director, and you have members from New York on your national committee. So certainly they all are influential in the work of the state committee. Being a former county chairman, in one of my hats I wore, I also was a member of the state committee, but not anymore. Not since I came here.
Okay. Thank you.
Emmy.
Hi there. I don't want to speak for all of my colleagues, but I think that there's a sentiment that there is just too far of a timeline between election day and when somebody needs to change their registration. Absent a reform, which sounds like it's very complicated and we should continue to work towards that, what are some of the things that your office does to make sure that we're getting the word out to every voter that if they want to switch parties, now is the time to do so? And or what do you see as maybe some short-term fixes in the absence of the ability to change this?
Those are good questions. I think it is so difficult in this day of communication. What do? We issue press statements, media alerts leading up to that deadline. So the state board did it. The governor's office did it. We tried to reach out to people and tell them that they can, if you want to enroll in a party next year, there are many advocates who are, might be interested in next year's primary cycle, who also encourage people to change their enrollment. The hard part is we live this business and an administrative level every day. But how do you reach the single head of household who has kids in school and gotta, deal with homework and meet with their teachers, etc., and get through to them? It's so much harder because when they, there's probably no doubt that anybody on this call or in the room with you today has a plan to vote on election day, but they have not developed. It's not their crisis today. So by the time they realize it's election day, I got to go vote, it's already too late. If they move too late, if the business. My personal view, since you asked, I believe we should have universal registration. I think we spend way too much time, energy, and money qualifying you by a particular deadline. We ought to have universal registration that you are qualified to vote. And then by the time it comes to election day, it's the manner in which you vote. Do you vote on a piece of paper and so-called fail-safe ballot, or do you vote on a machine? That's the only question that's left, so that I can get you in the right counting order later. I think that would do tremendous benefit for election administration resources to stop, trying to find you. If you universally meet the qualifications, then you should be entitled to vote. That's my own view.
So you're wildly popular in this room. I don't know about in the governor's office, but you're doing well here.
Well,
we'll hire you. Anyway, Elaine K. Mark.
Hi, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Could you clarify something about the court case you just mentioned? Okay, my understanding is that the preponderance of cases, at least coming from the Supreme Court, basically say that under a party's First Amendment rights, it can make the rules for its own nomination process. There are a couple exceptions, but it's basically there. So did your court, the court case you referred to, did that reinforce that or go against that?
It was litigated in the Independence Party, and it allows the state party, or in the case of a county party, because we have county, if it's authorized at the state level, that a county can also do it. So a county could also vote for offices within that county nominations to allow non-enrolled.
Okay.
So the Reform Party, what's being litigated right now, and it's in the 3rd Department in Albany, is only whether or not the leadership of the Reform Party are the correct persons, and if they go, the rule they filed goes with them. And then the old, and I guess it would next be litigated, was whether or not the previous leadership, whether or not it is authorized, or whether that party just is no longer had temporary leadership.
Okay.
So I think in the Independence Party, it's clearly been litigated for this issue. In the Reform Party, it's just whether or not the right person's running the party.
Okay, so let me ask you a hypothetical. If in 2019, the Democratic Party of New York State drew up a delegate selection plan which said unaffiliated voters or voters in other parties, perhaps with the exception of the Republican Party, are allowed to, we allow them to vote in the Democratic primary in 2020. Would that need to go through the legislature?
Well, if you would back up and add one more word for delegate to the National Convention, it probably would go, because it would not have to go for that fact, but every 4 years our legislature adopts the presidential plan. So what's in your plan, and if the state were to adopt it in its plan, to be honest, I think what is the deadline for the state Democratic Committee's plan? to be filed with you.
It'll come before the Rules and Bylaws Committee in, Jim, early 2019, right? I mean, we'll.
But I'm just thinking from my perspective.
Right, yes.
What?
Early 2019.
Yeah.
Then the full DNC later in the year.
Yeah. So early 2019, the
So from
DNC
my memory,
will. Say that again.
From my memory, we do an awful lot of work. I do an awful lot of work to help our party get your rule correctly. So that document also, one of the last bills that we push through the legislature every 4 years, that June, is the presidential election bill. So by the time they finish filling out their plan to file with you, and then like the equivalent, there's the Republican Party, we have a bill that we pass. It has a Part A and a Part B. Part A is the Democrats, Part B are the Republicans. There's a Part C for any other party that wants to adopt this plan to elect delegates to a convention. No other party does. When you say it doesn't have to go through the legislature, I agree with that, but it does anyway, and there's probably a likelihood they would just adopt it.
Okay. One final question. In your experience, was there ever a time where the Democratic State Committee or the Republican State Committee submitted a plan and then the legislature changed the plan before enactment?
I can't speak. I've only been in this role for 11 years, or excuse me, at the state board for 11 years, and this role for less than that. So I can't speak forever, but largely there's been a lot of discussions. We don't adopt this usually without input from the National Committee at that time. So I can't say that we wouldn't have a discussion to maybe amend the plan or amend something, but I don't think anybody's ever rejected.
Great. Thank you very much.
Jim.
The mouth.
The mouth. Oh. I thought someone was making a slur. This is for Jeff Berman. You raised the issue about in the calendar. I'm sorry, it's just happened. Never mind. You mentioned about the calendar year, the rules. Is it the calendar year or is it the year of? Is it a kind of fiscal year? Because the reason I ask is because I know in some states you have to file for delegate if you want to run for a delegate in the year preceding. And that becomes quite onerous because you don't sometimes know who the candidates are. And have we ever, do we know here, disqualified a state for having rules that violated that mandate?
Yeah. First of all, I don't think it's a fiscal year. It is.
So it would be in 2016.
It's the year of the presidential election.
Yeah.
So for 2020, it would be every step has to occur in advance of the November general election within the calendar year of 2020. So January 1 of 2020 is the first date you could have any step in the delegate selection process.
So if I'm not mistaken, in Illinois, and Jorge, you may know this, in Illinois, you have to file long in advance of that if you want to run for delegate.
Well, all right. So usually this question comes up in the case of filings for the presidential candidate or whoever, and the state party would come in and request a waiver from this requirement, and they would have a reason. They'd have to explain why they couldn't do it during the calendar year. So the question is whether a voter registration requirement would be of the same type that would have to be in the calendar year, or you would need to request a waiver.
Okay, just the issue of filing for delegate, though, is fundamentally different than registering.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's how you define the delegate selection process. Does it include the voters' eligibility to vote in the primary?
In New York, our statute places the federal primary in February, unless amended by the legislature. It's almost always amended by the legislature.
And when would you file to run for delegate in New York?
We tend, as far as I've been here, the first day to file the petitions has been in the after January 1. Okay. All right. But to sign the petitions has been before then. So usually we have the candidate, the delegates pledge, the pledges that they have to file with the party that they're pledged to support a candidate or not. Or I guess they have to be pledged to support the candidate. All of those filings are in after January 1, but the parties have to tell us by November 1st in a letter if they're going to utilize Part A or Part B, so we can start the planning. And it all depends for us. Are we at the earlier part of the cycle or the later part of the cycle? Where we fit into that queue. Because we have a federal court order for a June primary, when you had an earlier date of a national convention, there's no ability to say have an economy of scale to put it on that same federal primary day, because it's too late for your rules when the last cycle, because your deadline that all decisions had to have been made in time to prepare for the national convention was too late for us. So we could not even try to put them together. Because of that. But when you were later in September, then the nightmare is how do we get the candidates figured out in order to make the ballot to get them out by 45 days before. So it's a do or die situation for us. Either too early, too late. We live with it, but it's always a challenge when we have a presidential, we have the federal primary in June. We have other local primaries in both local elections in March and June, and then we have the state primary in September. So certainly if New York would make a political calendar that had a uniform election date, that would help us all to administer these things. But I have promoted that since 2010, and we don't have one yet.
Keep working at it. Okay, I have Jeff, and then we'll come back to Jeff. Jeff.
Hi, this is Jeff Weaver again. So I think between my conversation with you and Elaine's conversation with you, we have determined that the state Democratic Party could allow non-enrolled folks to participate in the Democratic primary process, notwithstanding any statutory change. The question that my colleague, Mr. Berman, asked, though, was about this issue of the early enrollment or party change deadline. And you'd indicated that there had been a court case by some Sanders supporters to try to challenge the constitutionality of that super early deadline for changing party affiliation. I think the question, though, really is, what if the state party was the party contesting that deadline as opposed to individual voters? There's a different set of First Amendment rights at issue if it is the state party which is contesting this super early deadline as opposed to voters, right? Because there's a different set of constitutional rights at issue.
Anything's possible. I try not to forecast what the court will do or won't do. I would hope they would bring that earlier as opposed to later, so we have plenty of time to prepare for it. My only concern is the clarity, and since we're dealing with this for the first time with the Reform Party, is we have military members or overseas voters, permanently disabled voters, who once they register, their application is good in the case of permanently disabled until their situation changes, meaning they file some other paper with us. But once they register, they get all the ballots they're entitled to until they tell us they don't want one anymore. So if I have a number of people. And now if I had an independence primary and a Reform Party and a Democrat Party on the same day with the same rule, and I know a number of states have the voter self-declares, this is what I want to vote today. That's easy when you're in front of me in person. I don't know how I would coordinate in New York with our short calendars by the time I know there's a primary to get a self-declaration, because we have 40,000 military and overseas voters. We have, tens of thousands of permanently disabled. How do I tell them there's a primary going on? So I look at the logistical issue. I just mail everybody everything and they can tell me back whatever they want. I think the party should probably tell me, I don't care if they voted in the other party primary, let them vote in mine also. I don't know the answer to that. There's the concept, do they only get to vote in one party primary? Or can they vote, which cares, they're only picking a nominee for the general election where they'll only vote once. And that's a policy question. I struggle myself with what's the right answer.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I do recall as a young man going into the primary ballot box with 3 primary ballots, perforated ballots, ripping one off, voting it, and putting the other 2 in the discard pile. So this, there are states that have sort of dealt with this issue on a.
Well, I agree with you. My brother is from the great state of Vermont, and he tells me they give him a folder with all these ballots in there. You pick the one you want, you vote that one, and you leave the rest on the tray on the way out. And I say that to people in New York, and they think I'm crazy. So we have a lot more moving parts than Vermont. But
you should hear what Vermont says about you.
Oh, I know. I have no doubt. But I keep saying to people, Maine figured this out, Vermont figured this out, Rhode Island figured this out. Why can't we figure this out?
Right, Virginia, another one. Okay, who has a lot of military members, obviously, in the state of Virginia.
Absolutely.
Commonwealth of Virginia, sorry, apologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeff.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back and just touch back on this rule which says that all steps in the delegate selection process must take place within the calendar year of the convention. And I do see that within our rules we have an entire rule on participation by voters. And so there's a whole discussion of how people can participate, should participate, what steps state parties have to take or should take with respect to participation, which may make it seem like this is part of the process since it is in the delegate selection rules. I'll also note there is actually a rule that says state parties shall take all feasible steps to encourage non-affiliated and new voters to register or enroll, to provide simple procedures through which they may do so, and to eliminate excessively long waiting periods for voters wishing to register or change their party enrollment status. So we've actually kind of touched on this in the rules in terms of state parties taking steps. This may be a little different or maybe not, but sort of shows where some of the policy is.
Thanks, Jeff. Anyone else? Just a couple of last questions. Roughly how many so-called independent, non-party registered voters are there in New York State?
I don't have the enrollment, but it's on our website. We have about 12 million voters. I don't have the breakdown in my head. I should, but certainly if you want the data, it's on the www.elections.ny.gov. My person who's actually helping me to run this, I don't know if he has the ability to go there. But total voters we have active are 12 million.
So it could be, without looking, several million voters that are independent that had to switch by last Friday in order to vote September 11th of 2018 in the state primaries.
Correct.
Okay.
Or the June federal primary.
Yeah, correct, or the June federal primary. And if you touched on this, but when was the last time there was an effort to change the statute, meaning to sort of bring it into line with what we might find elsewhere? Maybe not Vermont, that high a level, but sort of a moderate level. When was the last time there was an effort to, for example, say that the deadline to register to vote would be the same date that you could declare your party?
There are a number of bills in the Assembly. I can't say that there are a lot that move through the Senate, but certainly a number were considered by the State Assembly this past session. The Attorney General bill was an omnibus bill. It included a reform to the deadline. It was a very complicated deadline. So I, with all due respect to the Attorney General, I think it needs more work, his bill. But certainly there has been conversation, there are discussions as to what would be the appropriate a deadline other than one that is that old.
Okay, thank you. Not seeing any other comments, we're going to wrap this session up. We want to thank you for being with us.
If you wait 1 second, I'll tell you the top button. The top. Yep. Go to the last page. I'll tell you how many independent voters.
Oh,
we
great.
have.
We were waiting with bated breath for that number. Yes.
He's hitting the buttons for me. We have 6.2 million Democrats, 2.8 million Republicans, and we have 2.6 million non-affiliated. And all the rest are either conservative, green, working family, independents, women's equality, reform, or other associated groups who registered as blank, but they want us to keep track of them.
Okay, 2.86 million is the number I was looking for. Thank you for grabbing that from us. But more importantly, thanks for being with us today. And on behalf of everybody, we've learned a lot from your presentation. And keep up the great work.
Good luck with all your work. I'm glad we could have this conversation. Good day.
Okay, so the second part of today is an update, public update from each of the working groups that Jen outlined earlier. And as Jen mentioned earlier, so after this meeting, we'll go from sort of these updates to actual potential outcomes, and those will be determined by a majority of the commission at the final meeting, December 8th and 9th in Washington. So we'll start with with the primary election working group, and we'll start with the two conveners and then the other members of that group. And again, the purpose of this is to bring to the public, what's been going on in each of these four areas. So I don't know who's first here. We're back to Charlie and Jeff, or Jeff and Charlie.
I guess I go first again. One thing I think there's complete unanimity on in our subgroup is the idea that we want to encourage states generally to do everything they can to encourage same-day registration, automatic registration, any effort that increases participation and makes it easier for people to participate both in our processes but in elections generally. As we heard from this discussion in New York, we were confused by and remain confused, I guess, by the lack of the very distant deadlines between when you can register to vote and when you can switch parties. There are different flavors of us on this issue. We think it's fine for a party to require somebody to say they're a Democrat to vote in a Democratic primary. We think that that's certainly within the right of the party to do so, but we don't think that there should be deadlines that make it very inconvenient for folks to have to do that. Consistent with the resolution we operate under, we're working on ways to encourage states to have more primaries instead of caucuses. Mindful, as one of our colleagues on another subcommittee said, that there's another working group working on improving the fairness of the caucus system, and those systems will have to work together in some way. And then there's a discussion about just making sure that the actual numbers of delegates assigned to jurisdictions that aren't states is rational and is based on what we understand the charter requires. So.
Right, just Charlie, I think, encapsulated a lot of it. And I'm obviously of the flavor, the more people in, the better. And so, you know, we are still discussing these issues of open primaries. I think it was a revelation that a lot of us felt that the New York rule against independents participating in the New York primary was a statutory bar, but apparently it's not a statutory bar at all. It's the New York State Democratic Party that has determined that. So that may be something we should discuss with the party now that we have that particular information. But I do think that this issue of conforming these deadlines for registration and a party change has to be done, and obviously moving both deadlines as close to the election as humanly possible. You know, when we talk about caucuses versus primaries, one of the benefits I've seen in many places with caucuses is that you can walk in that day and sign up. And so it allows us to register a whole lot of new folks to participate not only in the Democratic Party but in elections in particular. So I think this committee is moving in the right direction, the subcommittee, in trying to get more people involved in the process to try to make the rules more streamlined and loosened up, even if there is some difference in flavors, as Charlie would put it, in terms of where we would like to end up in terms of participation of independent voters in the process.
Other members of that group? Sorry, I don't have actually a list of all four who are in that group.
If I
back to Charlie.
Yeah, just an observation from something that Jeff said. The staff of the DNC has actually done some really good work in giving us an understanding of where there are closed primaries, where there are open primaries, where there are registration deadlines. And one of the few little bright lights that came out of that is it is interesting how many states on their own or through voter referendum are moving to automatic registration. It was interesting to us that it's more than you would think given the Republicans' efforts to deny people the right to vote. So,
great. Just one thing that I think was clarified in this discussion, and I think is important to understand, the Rules Committee historically in approving delegate selection plans has been pretty lenient about the question of statute versus party rule. That in other words, when something is in statute, there is a Republican legislature, the party has taken provable positive steps. The Rules Committee has tended to say, okay, you're going to get a waiver on this because we do understand your hands are sort of tied. But clearly there is a lot that is in the hands of individual state parties. And there is no excuse. In other words, when the Democratic Party nationally says, at least for its presidential rules, we think this is the right way to do it, there should be no recourse. Okay, because we have the constitutional authority, we have court backing to say that we can create our own nomination rules, and the only counter to that historically ever has been way back with the Texas white primary system, where you can't have party rules that violate civil rights. But in terms of these sorts of things, you know, we have a lot of discretion, and it seems to me that this is one thing that this commission can really do and really make progress on.
Thank you. Others? Yeah, we can take some questions.
Okay, so I just have a question. Obviously, New York is a complicated situation, but perhaps we can set some sort of guidelines. If there's a state where the party is not ruling this, and it is a democratically controlled state, so say this scenario was the party, that it was left to the legislature, and the legislature was there to determine the rules. He had briefly mentioned 8 Democrats who are caucusing as Republicans right now, preventing that legislation from being passed. That's essentially what's happening there. Yeah. Can the DNC do anything to make a statement to the state party? I mean, is there anything that we can do to oversee that process to make sure that the Democrats work with the Democrats? Or I don't know how that would be.
Sure.
Functional.
I mean, look, the reason we review delegate selection plans and approve them in the first place is that states after the 1972 convention, which was incredibly chaotic, wanted some protection against challenges to their delegation on the floor of the convention. And so one of the protections was if you create a delegate selection plan, you get it approved by the national party, and then you implement it as you said, you are free from a series of kinds of challenges. And that's actually worked fairly well over the years. We've had many fewer credentials fights than we used to have. So the party's option in your scenario is to turn down the New York State delegate selection plan. If it does not, if the Unity Commission sends to the DNC a recommendation that this should be done as close as possible to that, we should ease up on changing or allowing people to become Democrats, and a party does not fulfill that law, it has very few grounds for a waiver. Okay, I mean very few grounds for a waiver, and the DNC Rules Committee can simply not approve the delegate selection plan. That becomes a big problem because an unapproved delegate selection plan, as we saw in some of us in 2008 with Florida and Michigan, an unapproved delegate selection plan raises the question of the seating of an entire delegation. And that's a big problem. So yeah, the party, through its ability to approve plans or give waivers, right, as the case may be, has a fair amount of power in this. And by and large, the courts have reinforced the party's authority in these matters. So, suppose we were to turn down the New York State delegate selection plan, it went to court, the court most likely would say, no, the Democratic Party has the right to do this. Political parties have the right to control their nominations.
Jim.
Just a few points about these waivers. First of all, the situation falls into one of several buckets. One is where the state party clearly controls the rules for the particular process. That's where we have the greatest influence. Secondly, there's a situation where you have a Democratic legislature and governor, more influence for enforcing the rules, although not a slam dunk, because legislatures do not always go along with party rules on these things. The real strong argument for a waiver is usually when you have a Republican-controlled legislature and the Republicans take a different approach than we have. Now, on the timing issue, for example, gradually we got the Republicans to be in basically the same frame that we're in, and so things began to change on that. But the other point I wanted to make is that in the sequence in which this all appears, usually what we have is the Rules and Bylaws Committee as an organization and its members argue for enforcing the rules, and the state party comes in and argues for why the rules should not be imposed on them. And maybe their argument prevails, or maybe some compromise is enacted. What there usually isn't is an advocacy group pushing for enforcing the rules. And that's partly because the campaigns usually are not yet paying attention when this is done, and there are not ongoing organizations with an interest in this. That may be different in this cycle. There may be ongoing organizations who we will hear from on this, and that could be very helpful. The sort of information that we got today might well not have come to us in previous cycles.
Can I just follow up that quickly, Larry?
Well, I have the chair next, and then you'll follow her. Yeah. Anyone else, just indicate you want to speak, please.
That's probably not going to happen that often, Jeff, so I'll take up on on that. So I just want one point that's just something that we discussed earlier today that I've been thinking about a little bit more. But, you know, in light of our discussion this morning and the question about what the New York Board of Elections does to educate people around these deadlines, there's certainly, you know, a baseline of stuff that they do, press releases and otherwise, but certainly not enough if we continue in this situation. So, you know, one of the things that we've discussed is the role of the National Party to educate around challenging situations like this, certainly in places where there's Republican control and we're not able to make adjustments at the local level. But I also feel like there's a really important need for the local state parties to build a very strong infrastructure that is educating, you know, every day of the year about this, so that it becomes more of a just a known factor. Because as we all well know, most people don't even think about elections until we're hitting, you know, September, you know, just before we get to a general election. So, you know, there's a lot that can be done tactically, certainly with the technology that we have and our ability to have, you know, wide reach from all the elements of the party. I think it's really important for all of us to think about every single place that we can build out education programs at every level to ensure that that becomes part of the routine, but also a really important role of the national and state parties in situations like this. And obviously that goes to the importance of educating voters, and a role that we as a party take very seriously. But I think these instances are going to require a lot more in a sustained way and a resourced way.
Yeah, just to follow up on Elaine's remark, in addition to not approving the delegate plans, we certainly could also structure the allocation of delegates in a way that penalizes states that take certain actions.
Emmy.
I want to build off of what Nomiki, Jen, and Jeff just said. I guess I would want to hear from you, Elaine, a little bit more. I know we're talking about delegate selection process, but does it include, for example, like a voting checklist, for example, for a state party? We've just learned this about New York, that New York could have taken steps to make it more inclusive. Are we assessing how inclusive they're being? Are they going to the edge as to how many voters can we allow, voter registration deadlines, party switching deadlines, et cetera? And also adding an education component, right? And saying like, okay, well, are you doing these 10 recommended things? And if you're not, why? And, you know, tying that to delegate allocation, but also, honestly, state parties are getting funds from the DNC. And if they're making a conscious decision to, I don't think anyone's making a conscious decision to withhold votes, for the record, but if they're making a conscious decision to not go all the way, we should know why, and we should take actions to address that.
You know, every delegate selection plan that I've read, and I've read most of them since 1980, I hate to say that, has a requirement in it for an affirmative action plan. And the affirmative action plan not only includes goals for underrepresented groups, but the affirmative action plan more broadly is the education plan of the state party. Okay, how many training sessions are you going to do? How many mailings are you going to do? These plans actually get quite specific. The Rules and Bylaws Committee has frequently asked serious questions to states about their affirmative action plans. There's a process for challenging an affirmative action plan or a delegate selection plan if people think that it's not adequate, okay? And occasionally this happens. So this gets laid out really very far ahead of the process. Now, where the rubber meets the road, I mean, Yvette has written many of these, right? Where the rubber meets the road is when people think that the state party actually hasn't lived up to its promises in terms of education and outreach. And I know that the presidential candidates and campaigns, which I've been in many of them, they are often sort of irked because they come into a state and they discover that the state party hasn't done what's in the plan. They think they're going to win delegates. They don't want the delegates challenged, and therefore the presidential campaign ends up having to run the affirmative action program for the state party. So that's where it really does get sort of messy. But that, in theory, right, this is supposed to all be laid out, and the Rules and Bylaws Committee finishes its work more than a year ahead of the presidential primaries, and so then the parties are supposed to implement.
One thing that I would just add, just to be fair to state parties, a lot of times I think when the affirmative action is not implemented completely, it could be due to funds.
Could be what?
Due to funding.
Oh, yeah. Look, absolutely. I mean, that's usually what happens, right? Which is the party ends up not having the money, right, to do it. They go to the presidential candidates. I mean, we had this, Charlie, in California, Jeff, where, remember, they were asking the presidential candidates to pay for the venues for the post-primary caucuses because the party couldn't pay to rent the venues. I mean, this is kind of a, mess out there often because of that. Hopefully in 2020, we will have 50 incredibly strong state parties and nobody will worry about it.
Keep pushing. Senator Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to, on something that the chairwoman said about the DNC really taking the lead to educate our voters and states about what the rules are and using the state of New York as one of the worst examples. But we really do need to declare, I think, as a party, that structures like the one in New York are unacceptable, and especially when Democrats are in control. So we're going to affirm as a party that we will fight for voting rights across the board and that we're willing to fight our own if necessary. That if Republicans were doing this, we would be crying bloody murder. So we just got to make sure that the DNC, besides the education point, I think we need to make it clear that we want to change, and that change has to come even if we have to fight members of the Democratic Party within the state of New York, because it is wholly unacceptable that Democrats who have the power to change this right now, they don't have to wait till tomorrow, they don't have to wait till next year, they can change it right now, but yet they continue to allow this process to work because it works for establishment folks within those states, and they don't care about the voters. So if we're going to charge Republicans with voter suppression in New York, voter suppression is coming at the hands of Democrats. And I can't tell you how many times, and my congresswoman is here, that when I was in the state legislature fighting for Ohioans to keep access to the ballot box that they have, how many times my Republican colleagues threw New York up in my face as saying that the state of Ohio, even though they took away voting access in Ohio, the fact that it was very limited in New York was the battle cry of my Republican colleagues to hurt us in Ohio as we tried to protect what Ohioans had. So we got to declare right now that New York, this is unacceptable, and it doesn't matter if it's friend or foe, we got to do away with this and do away with it right now.
Jim Zogby.
Elaine, you did get to the point later about these rules are there, the procedures are there, but they're sometimes honored more in the breach than in the observance. And the problem is we lack an effective enforcement mechanism. And that's one of the things we'll talk about later when we come to my bucket. But this question of if rules aren't being lived up to, what do you do? Where do you go? Who do you go to? And so I appreciate that. Thank you. Because I've seen that. I mean, we have an affirmative action guideline in Michigan. I know about it. Arab Americans have benefited from it. It has frequently just simply not been honored.
Absolutely. And look, the ultimate discipline is bringing challengers, right? Bringing challenges to a delegation, not seating a delegation. The toughest the Democrats have been historically has been in the timing issue, where because of we went through more than a decade of states trying to jump up earlier and earlier and earlier, so that in 1988 we had the Iowa caucuses on January 3rd, and we were really in a position of voters being ready to shoot us for just campaigning at Christmas time, and it was just nuts. That got resolved, frankly, not by us. Well, it got resolved in two ways. One is Jim Roosevelt, bless his heart, got together with the Republicans, and it was in the interest of both parties to stop this insanity of an earlier and earlier and earlier system. And in fact, we now have a decent working relationship with them on that one issue. It may be the only issue in the entire universe where we have a working relationship with Republicans. But I think the second thing was that in 2008, we held firm on Florida and Michigan. And it was not lost on states that in the end, if the party really wanted to, the party really could make states stick to its rules. So that's the fight that we have had historically. We do have some, but generally the disputes haven't risen to the level, you know what I mean, where that would happen.
I'm less interested here in the rules of procedure as I am in the engagement rules. And those are the ones that I was thinking about. And not just affirmative action, but the training programs and making the process of becoming a delegate available to Democrats who want to run. That is, I always say, the best kept secret in American politics is American politics. And trying to pry the rules sometimes from the state requires sometimes a bit of a, you have to go in with a bit of a club to get them. You get them, and then you have to translate them into English for people and do your own training, which is what we've been forced to do oftentimes because people simply can't figure out what does this mean, how do I do that?
Yeah.
So that's something I think that we really need to take a look at.
Well, and that's going to be in your bailiwick too, in terms of party strengthening, yeah.
Okay, those on the commission who didn't speak on this, anyone else? I'm going to come last to know me, otherwise. Anyone else? Okay. No.
Jorge asked me to ask more questions. So, expanding on this a little bit more, during the primary process as a delegate for Bernie Sanders in New York, we faced a lot of challenges with our state committee. We actually sued the state committee because they didn't follow their own rules. It was very well documented. They shut down debate. This isn't a Bernie-Hillary situation. This is a New York State Democratic Party situation. You have the state Senate, the Democrats, who are incredibly frustrated with our governor who controls the state party, the finances of the state party. He appoints everybody who's on the state party for the most part, who's basically deciding whether or not to follow the rules, right? So my question is, other than delegate allocation, which I don't think Governor Cuomo cares 2 cents about unless he's running for president, what else can we do? And it's not just New York. I mean, there's a couple of other states that have very early registration deadlines, you know, like 3 that are Democratic control. Not as much as New York, literally hundreds of days in difference. But what else can we do as a governing, or as a reforming commission to make sure that in the future the Democrats, I mean, he's taking state funds. Let's just be, I mean, he's taking DNC funds, putting into the state party, and not using it to elect Democrats. This is something, he has a fund, he doesn't release the funds, he doesn't engage the party, he controls the funds. What can we do to make sure that the Democratic Party in New York State is held accountable?
Let me just say, a lot of that should be in your bucket,
True, yes.
Rather than, this one's really on primary elections. So,
it's related.
Given that you're part of that one, that'd be great. And, you know, my own wish is that that group looks a lot more at state parties. How do they function? And as we all know, there's 57 of them. And we heard in the first, there we go, we had clapping for the 57, not just, but as we heard in the first presentation from Attorney Sandler, one of the problems is these 57 parties are way too independent. That wasn't just a Jim Crow Mississippi Freedom Democrats problem. That's a legal structure that persists to this day. But that is bucket 4. Party reform doesn't just mean the DNC. Party reform means much more so than the DNC. People live in these 57 parties. So if you can pull that back into your group, that'd be great, because we actually need to get more of that, in my opinion, in that group. Others on primaries. Members of this group. Lots of progress.
Thanks so much. Okay, we're going to move on to caucuses, and caucuses is something that We have talked about and heard from experts throughout the course of this process, and I'm going to ask the leaders of our caucus working group to take us through where we are in the process and begin the discussion here. So I'm going to kick it to Jane Klebb and to Mayor Webb.
Let me begin by saying that we want to speak on something that has nothing to do with our bucket. We do believe in universal registration works for everybody. So we do support that. So the charge for our for caucus reform is, and I'll just read the charge, is that the language of the resolution says eligible voters' ability to participate in the caucuses are protected. The Commission shall make recommendations as to how caucuses can be less burdensome, more inclusive, transparent, and accessible to participants. Specific consideration shall be given to so-called firehouse caucuses and other methods that will permit expanded and higher volumes of voter participation. These steps shall include ensuring caucuses are well-run, accessible, transparent, and that the delegates allocated to the National Convention fairly reflect the will of the voters expressed during their caucuses. The Commission shall make specific recommendations to streamline the caucus realignment process, including measures to accommodate increased voter participation and decrease the time necessary to conduct the caucus. The Commission shall make specific recommendations that require caucuses to publish the specific head count at all caucus locations and to maintain sufficient records to make a post-caucus review and recanvass as of those results. And as part of our discussion, I think there were, 5 on our committee? Some of the areas that we did talk about in terms of increasing participation also included the location on where caucuses would be held, that all caucus sites would have same-day registration, that in addition to same-day registration, that we would also look for requirement that all caucus sites would also be the sites for same-day drop-off and absentee mail-in ballots as well. Jane?
Some of the other specific reforms that we would like to see implemented is that if you do a caucus site, if you do a caucus process as a state, that you would have to have available on-site party voter registration, so same-day voter registration. This would make it very accessible for independents that currently aren't part of our party and who want to vote for a Democratic president. It would also make sure that voters who may not understand the complicated process sometimes in some of our states, so they would be able to register as voters that day. I will say that for large states, maybe this would be burdensome, but for small states like Nebraska, Iowa, who have caucuses, it's actually a really good way for us to build our party since we aren't large and don't have huge budgets. The other thing that we'd want to do is institutionalize a national training program that all caucus states would have to go through, as well as the caucus site leaders. So there's some uniformity in how caucuses are run. Some caucus sites are run awesome, some not so great. A lot of that just simply has to do with training. Really well-intended volunteers just need the training resources. And so that's something that we would want the DNC to institutionalize and then be able to personalize it at the state and local level. We want to make sure that the reporting of the caucus results, as Mayor Webb said, is also standardized, and that there's a system that states and the caucus sites would be able to put in their data, and so it would all feed in to then the DNC, and it would also make it easier for any campaigns that think that they want to contest the results would be able to have access to, or voters can see that information as well. We definitely are still in discussion on how to streamline the realignment process. There's some discussion with doing away with realignment altogether. That really mostly impacts Iowa. And so we're really working to make sure that that continues to be fair for our first caucus state that has a deep tradition of realignment that we still want to honor. And then we certainly want to make it clear that we think that caucus sites should all have a firehouse caucus process, meaning that somebody can come into the caucus site, vote, and leave. We know that working people can't always stay for the 4 to 8 to 10 hours that sometimes happens in caucuses. So that will either be coming on site to register your vote for the person that you want to be the Democratic nominee, Or it could mean you do it through absentee, right? So you would mail in your vote to the state party. So we really do want to keep the ability of states to have a caucus if they so choose, but we have to institutionalize process to make it more accessible to voters, especially working class families.
One other area that we also stated is that we believe all materials for training and all materials that's distributed should all be bilingual for the caucuses.
And then one last thing that we'll say is we also think that the caucuses, the states that choose to do it, should really look at the date, because they have control over the date that they can do their caucus, and that we try to do that around regionals with primaries. So candidates can go and visit these caucus states, which are often smaller states, which often get ignored by presidential candidates. So this would be a way for voters to actually engage with candidates as well.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask the commission members if folks want to add in. I don't know, Jan, if there's a few things that you want to say off the top.
Okay, technology can be challenging. Yeah, we really appreciate Iowa. I really appreciate the attention and the sincere desire to work with us in maintaining a lot of our long-held traditions. But we firmly believe that caucuses are a great way to build party, and we as a state would be lost without them. And I think it's something that we encourage the existing caucus states to really embrace an opportunity to use them to help build their own personal parties from the grassroots up.
Great. One thing I want to add is, we had heard from experts who work within caucuses, some from large states, some from small. We have our own expert right here on the commission with Jane from Nebraska. But talking a little bit about how the National Party can work to convene caucus states as they go through a planning process, helping to support what we're learning for people that are on the front end of the process to those that come later. Certainly, states like Iowa, who've been going through this, in Nevada, have run through a lot of different hoops and processes and systems that have worked and not worked, and I think there's a lot of value there. That has happened, that discussion of best practices, I think in an ad hoc way, and I think that there's ways that we can look at from a national standpoint to really bring together caucus states to ensure that the recommendations that we're making here, the attempts we're making to adjust the system to allow for more inclusion, will be enhanced if we're supporting these states specifically, but then the states that are actually conducting caucuses are supporting each other. And then on top of that, I think there's a lot of really wonderful, talented work that the DNC has and state parties have from a technical standpoint, from an expertise standpoint around caucuses, that we want to make sure that we think about how can we institutionalize that a little bit more so that there's added support for running these caucuses. As we all know, a big part of what we talk about a lot is what state parties need to continue to grow and evolve, and a lot of that comes down to resources, and these caucuses are often, a majority run by volunteers, with the support of some really great state and staff and states, but really looking at what else we need to be doing to support those states that are running caucuses so that we can ensure that the guidelines that are set are actually supported and followed through based on people that have the right training and support to be able to do that. Any other commission members want to add anything or throw out any additional comments or questions on the caucuses? Okay, great. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Larry to take us through the next group.
Great. So the next group is Unpledged Delegates Working Group. Lucy Flores and David Wynn were the conveners, and then we had other members. So start with the two of you in either order.
Thanks, Larry. So we worked on the unpledged delegates, or better known as super delegate reforms. And and we all agree here in our group that the role of unpledged delegates should be revised and reduced. We also think that we have to find better ways of promoting and pushing for a more diverse unpledged delegate group. The mandate is pretty explicit in what it calls for in terms of reforming this group of delegates. It calls for DNC members to be pledged based on the results of their state caucus or primary contests. And we are moving in the next few days and weeks to work out the logistics, but I think we're in a pretty good place. And you know, the resolution is pretty clear on what needs to be done, and we're working on just making sure that we get all the kinks right. Lucy, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
I mean, I did want to clarify that the language at this point, and these are the logistics and kinks that we're working out, actually create kind of two categories, if you will, of the unpledged delegates. One of that category being members of Congress, elected officials, some elected officials, distinguished party leaders who do not become bound based on the outcome of their state races. And then the other category of remaining unpledged delegates that do become bound. And I want to make it clear that virtually everyone on this commission has an issue with that. And so we're working through the logistics and the kinks because it is very specific in terms of the language that is included in our resolution that came as a result of course, the convention from last year. So I think we're in a good place in terms of everyone really recognizing and being in agreement that we are not we're not okay with creating these two different categories, because what we all emphasize is that the unpledged delegates that are within our state parties, within our grassroots, et cetera, are actually the most important voices. And those voices should not be treated as any lesser than anybody else. So that being said, we have a lot of work to do in the next couple of weeks to finally come with some final language, but we're making good progress.
Okay, others from the group? Either of the others from your group want to comment, or we'll throw it open then to the commission as a whole? Comments on this? Okay, we're getting talked out here, but it's, maybe that's a good thing. Okay, the chair is going to handle the next group, but since she's out of the room right now, I'll start it off. So the last group, as we referenced earlier, we termed party reform. In many ways, it has the least of the language of the two-page document that created this commission, because as we all know, the commission was largely created in reference to the presidential nominating process in 2016. But the drafter, the Rules Committee of the convention, and then the convention as a whole, did include some language about the need to look at party reform. And as we referenced earlier, this is party reform at every level, with the mandate that how do you create a party that is wide open, that people join it in where they live, in their precinct, in their county, in their state, and they feel like when they join it, they can lead it. And how do we, the DNC, operate in a way that enhances that positive feeling? So with that, I will kick this to Jorge and Jim, who were the conveners, and then the other members of that working group.
Sure. Thank you. So we thought through this in a couple different buckets. The first one being, how are we going to make the party more inclusive up and down? And some ways that we came up with, and Jim can speak to some of the ideas he has, and Nomiki as well. But making sure that we are opening up the bidding process for and setting a metric for diverse consultants to join the party, to participate in elections that the DNC is doing. Also, member education. How do you become a party leader? How do you become a DNC member? Really making that, doing education around that, putting that on our website, making it more accessible for folks to do that. Another recommendation was to do term limits for DNC members. There's folks that have been serving for a very long time, and you were really grateful for them. But as we continue to build a pipeline, making sure that people have a place to go and a place to enter. The other one is educate. Oh, the donor and volunteer list when campaigns end, making sure that the DNC is able to have access to those lists, making sure that the state parties have access to those lists so that they can continue to build on that. Right now, sometimes some campaigns do it, but we want to make sure that it is a more streamlined process so that the people that have been engaged over the last 2 years can remain engaged. And making sure that we're advancing in technology and letting the information that we have around our rules and bylaws, that is also evolving with the times.
Like the other groups, we don't have complete consensus, but we do have some agreement on general principles. There is especially after the most recent discussions we have, I think that there's a broad commitment to increase participation and diversity, to create a greater sense of accountability in party structures, greater sense of transparency, and also more democracy. These are the keys, we think, to growing the party and bringing more people into the party. Where there are still issues that have to be worked out is in the question of how deep the structural changes have to go, how institutionalized we have to become to make these changes happen. Some of the proposals we have, for example, have to do with the very process of becoming a member of the DNC and at-large membership, and what are the role of DNC members in the election process. And so some of us have proposed a nominating committee be created to take the sort of the mystery out of the process and create a process that is absolutely transparent. Also is, as I mentioned to Elaine, an idea to create a judicial review so that candidates and DNC members and Democrats have a place to go when they feel that the rules and bylaws are not being honored. We also took a close look at the charter and bylaws and are looking at ways to implement the bylaw on the budget. The bylaws specifically say that annual reports on goals, purposes of expenditures, and results of expenditures, should be discussed by the DNC and executive committee of the DNC, both. And that's something we want to continue to push happen so that there be transparency. Many of the issues we've talked about, lack of funds, we don't have the money to do this or no money to do that, is a mystery because we don't know where how much money there is or where the money goes or who the people are getting it or how effective are the programs being carried out. Issue that Larry has raised and has been has been pushing us on is the question of ensuring that state parties are accountable and democratic as well. And so the idea here is to create an accountability and effectiveness mechanism so that as we give grants to states, we also have a vehicle that will say to states, these are the metrics we expect you to realize or to achieve. And some of those metrics could be everything from voter registration goals to hiring get out the vote staff to making new people, making it possible for new people to become everything from precinct delegate to county central committee to state committee. This process is completely unknown to most Democrats, and so what we want to do is to create a situation where parties are encouraged, actually mandated, to use funds that they get in order to build that bench that Jorge talks about. I'm not sure myself that term limits are necessary as much as it is to create a process from the bottom up. Wellington Webb had an idea that I think is really important that could be also a part of this effectiveness mechanism, and that is there are all these young local elected officials being brought into office around the country. We don't know them sometimes. We don't encourage them. We don't court them. We don't bring them to DNC meetings and make them feel part of the institution, and so that's something that we also want to make a part of this. And then there was an idea that had come forward about creating a program that is operating in rural Virginia called the Democratic Promise, which takes volunteers in rural counties where the Democratic brand has been suffering and or has become extinct, and going door to door, instead of canvassing for votes or canvassing for money, saying, do you have something that we can do for you? Can we help you sign up for Medicare? Can we help you sign up for Social Security? Can the Democratic Party assist you in solving problems that you may have that are government-related problems, as a way of encouraging people to feel that the party is there for them? It works in this area of Virginia, and we'd like to see it not initially become national. It's too big a leap, but to start in some areas of the country where we need to do this, in red states and red counties, in purple states, in order to regain some brand identification that people have with the party. So the issue here is and where we're still working is, how do we institutionalize? Do we institutionalize to get these? These are goals. Goals are nice, but our feeling is, some of us have the feeling that unless you create committees and actually empower those committees to do this, some of these things aren't going to happen. They just become goals we talk about, but there needs to be somebody there who's the cop that sort of directs traffic and says, how did we miss that guy in Alabama who just got elected? How did we miss that woman in Iowa who just got elected, and that we need to know them? Or why is this state party not doing what we've asked them to do? Or why are we getting complaints from people in Illinois that they're not getting what they need, et cetera? So the question of institutionalization is something that we're still struggling with, but we've got a real good discussion and a general commitment to reform. And the question is just how deep do we go in making it happen? Thank you.
Naomi, you want to go?
So Jim and Jorge have actually covered a lot of what were my proposals, which have combined, but I'll bring up 2 points. The first is, well, 3. I want to reinforce the budget. Everyone's laughing. It's my personal obsession. We can't know how we lost 1,100 seats, how we lost a presidency against a man who, we outspent, was it 3 times as much? We can't know where we made these mistakes unless we know where we spent the money. And right now, that seems to be a unilateral decision, and the budget is not transparent. So I think having a more participatory budget process for the future and an assessment of the past budget would be really important. And Jim has brought up having a committee to oversee that. So I do have one question for Jim about how we make sure those committees are fairly balanced and they're not just stacked with people that don't hold the body accountable.
In the proposals that we wrote up, they call for them to be elected by the body, by the executive committee, and some from the state chairs and from the general membership. And I feel strongly about that. I think that I've been on the DNC for 25 years. I said to myself a moment ago, a quarter of a century. That sounds a lot longer. I'm probably ready for your term limiting. Or would it be a half century is the term? I don't know. And we have some disagreement about that. I wouldn't want to lose Jim Roosevelt for the world. And there are other people that I've worked with over the years that have just meant so much and I've learned so much from. And I think we have to have a way of discussing this one. But yeah, I mean, I think that DNC members need to be empowered to make some of these decisions. And that's something I feel very strongly about, having been on the body for 25 years. We had an election at the last time, and we elected all the officers. It was the most exciting meeting I've ever been at. I want more of those. I'd like to have an election for a finance review committee. I'd like to have an election for a nominating committee. I'd like to have an election for who among the state chairs are going to be elected by their peers to be the effective, the accountability mechanism folks who will help do that. To make the Democratic Party democratic is actually a good thing, and I think will empower us, strengthen us, and create what Jorge wants, is the opportunity for new people to come up the ranks and be empowered to be able to do something. And I think that this process is so exciting because we've all been engaged. Every DNC member ought to have the same opportunity to be this engaged in this kind of process so that their membership actually means something in terms of decision-making to direct the future of our country.
So I think that's exactly, I mean, if you think about it, it's not that I'm saying that, I want to kick Jim off the DNC and that's it. Yeah. But at some point, Jim will decide that he doesn't want to be part of the DNC, or he's going to step aside, and we need to ensure that there is people that could fill that role. So if there is term limits, you can make sure that you're bringing up the Farm League, and Jim is sharing all that knowledge to someone that he is trying to, make sure that they continue to go up. And at some point when he is ready to step aside, there is someone to backfill that, because what we don't want is someone to just leave and that information leaves.
So I just want to follow up with the next points. I really think this would be a great idea, and I think it could loop into your Virginia program, the state hearings, to go state by state and understand how the state parties are functioning, where their unique problems are. Maybe it's regional, maybe you have regional hearings every once in a while like this, where state party chairs and other activists in the community can come and talk about the struggles that they're facing uniquely, so the DNC isn't left in the dark when suddenly we lose an election that we thought we were going to win, or we find out that the state party doesn't have enough money to build a pipeline, or that a state that we thought was going to go blue in 2020 is actually really far behind by the time we're in 2020 because they don't have the resources. So that's one other proposal. And I think that ties into the final proposal, which is how do we hold these states accountable when you have bad actors? And I come from one of those states. and there's a lot of frustration in New York over a very active Democratic Party. We have a lot of the things that a lot of states don't have. We have local county committees that aren't vacant, that people want to run for. They may not know how to run for those local county committees, but they're engaged. We have county clubs. We have local neighborhood clubs still to this day. We have reform clubs. We have Our Revolution chapters. So it's really encouraging to see this kind of activism across the state. It's not just downstate. It's in Buffalo, in Western New York. It's in Albany, in Binghamton. I was in Binghamton a few weeks ago and saw a lot of activism. So when you have a state like that that has all the things that we want and it's democratically controlled, how do we hold those who are in power accountable? Especially if they're not responsive to the delegate situation. And I think that's something we really need to consider. Obviously, New York is an extraordinary example, but there's a lot in between that I think we can consider for other states.
Thanks. I'm going to call on Jim Roosevelt.
Okay, thanks. As another member of this working group, I think we have a lot of consensus on overall goals. We don't have full agreement on mechanisms. But the goals of better communication and consultation and openness within the DNC, and thereby really opening to the party as a whole, I think we share very strongly. I have some concerns, which I've shared in the group, about too many processes, too many committees overseeing various aspects that basically would not just guide the chair, but restrict the chair and take up staff time away from what needs to be the real purpose of DNC staff and the organization as a whole, which is listening to the American people and crafting a message that meets their real needs and problems, first of all, and most importantly, recruiting candidates to carry that message, and supporting our incumbents as well as our new candidates, and finally raising the resources to make all that effective. I think we want to be sure that we don't, in this process of introspection that we've been going through, we want to be sure we don't lose sight of the fact that this is really not about how we deal with ourselves internally. This is about how do we lead the country to a better America. And then the final thing that I would raise is we do have to be realistic about how much oversight the DNC has over state parties. We kind of talk as if a $10,000 or even a $50,000 contribution to their expenses gives us the chance to audit all of their successes and failures. And in fact, unlike political parties in other countries, state parties have actually much more autonomy than people realize. People will talk about, why does the DNC have the state party do this or that? Because the state party doesn't really care about what the DNC thinks about this or that. But the DNC does have the opportunity to both lead by example and lead by exhortation. So that's, I think, what we're talking about here. And we've got to remember that it's not necessarily a matter of saying you must do this and it will happen.
Good point. I'm going to go to Yvette and then Mayor Webb.
As someone who's been a state party chair, let me speak to this. First of all, we have a very robust organization called the Association of State Democratic Chairs that works very, very hard. We have these kind of postmortems. We have these kinds of trainings. We have this going on all of the time within our organization. As a matter of fact, when I came into the DNC, I came in through the ASDC. It is a very close organization, but it is a very vibrant organization. And it has the ability to go back and self-assess and self-correct. And we have been able to achieve that because we understand how our states work. There is not a one-size-fits-all for the state parties. So to say that the DNC has to manage the state parties, that cannot be done. Everybody's state is different. In my state, for example, we were led by our governor, Martin O'Malley, right, who was very invested in the state party. He not only raised the money for the state party, but he made sure that we had everything we needed to make sure that our delegate selection plans were as they should be, that we were able to do the trainings and we were able to go around the states. Everybody doesn't have that if you don't have a Democratic governor, so every state party does have to maintain that autonomy. It might be helpful if maybe we would have Ken Martin of the ASDC to come in. I don't know if we'd have the time to do that or to do a written presentation so that everyone can really understand how that whole organization works and how vibrant it is and how necessary it is, but how we do need to maintain our autonomy because we have other people that we need to answer to within our states. So that's the one thing that I want to clear up, because I hear this this state party thing, and it's like we come under this umbrella, and the DNC is here, the state party is here. Yes, we all work towards the same things, but the state party does have to maintain its separate autonomy because of our own political structures in our state that we have to be aware of and that we, quite frankly, answer to. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I wanted to hit on is something that I mentioned earlier. When we talk about diversity, the one thing that I think needs to go into this party reform is a better structuring of our caucuses. That is our diversity in the party. We have these caucuses, and these caucuses need to be more vibrant, they need to be more active, and they need to be the arm in the states, once again, because our caucus members come from the states. Our caucus members can be their own chairs of their particular caucuses in their states and work with their state parties. That's a better way to use the caucuses, it seems to me. If each caucus person considered him or herself the chair of that caucus in their state, and they became the person that flowed the information up to the DNC. The last thing that I want to mention is when we talk about diversity, the diversity has to be in hiring, but it has to be in contracting. And as I've said before, we had a diversity leader before, and that was a wonderful concept, but it is too big a job for one person. We need a diversity team, a team that can answer the needs of each constituency group that we have as a part of our party, and to make sure that their voices are being heard. Now, when I was chair of the Maryland Democratic Party, we had the diversity leadership councils, and those people actually had a seat on the executive committee. So we had the AAPI Council, the African Council, the Hispanic Council, the LGBT. We had it all because I wanted everyone to feel like they had a place at the table. So if we're really serious about diversity, then we have a team, not a person, that is devoted to diversity in the Democratic Party, so that the DNC is hearing from the voices that show up at the polls, that vote, that keep us the DNC. That's it.
Mayor Webb.
The diversity issue, and we talked about it some earlier, as it relates to contracts, and I want us to think about it from this standpoint. The diversity on contracts and vendors for the DNC is not to reach an affirmative action goal or fill out a box. It's to expand the talent pool of the women and minority firms that are out there that could expand the outreach of our party as a whole, because many of these firms are not being reached, and if they're used, by virtue of them being used and being contracted with the DNC, it would also expand the outreach of the DNC at the grassroots level.
Exactly. Jim Zogby.
Just a couple points. First, in relation to some of the comments that Jim Roosevelt made, which I do appreciate, but while I believe that staff have an important role to play and certainly do have the tasks that you have delineated, I am concerned that the DNC itself, that the members of the DNC are not so empowered to do those very things. I spoke early on in this process when we were starting this. I had a talk with Rob Stein, who you'll remember was Ron Brown's chief of staff. And he said, one of the first things I realized when we took over at the DNC is that there is no governing body. There is no governing authority. The way it operates, the way it is in operation. And I thought that needed to be looked at. How do we make the DNC a governing body? How do we empower people so that it's the DNC members themselves are structured to recruit candidates, to raise money, to be the voice of the DNC around the country? They are in their own caucuses, they are in their state parties, but the DNC itself as an institution doesn't empower them in that way. And on the question of state chairs, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I know state parties, I've worked with state parties, and I know how vibrant many of them are. I also know there are some who aren't. Oh, yeah, and there are ones that, and this is directed not at the vibrant state parties, but this is directed, and the reason you have an accountability mechanism is to say, you guys are doing great, and we're gonna bump your money up. And if you can use $50,000 instead of $25,000 a month, that's great. But you guys are not doing it, and here are some recommendations we'd like to make to help you be better. This is not like setting up a party cop process, you know, where we're going to go in and send them off to Siberia someplace. But what we're going to do is hopefully say through the state, and if you look at the proposal, it forms this accountability mechanism out of the State Chairs Association. It needs to be grounded in the state chairs, who will be able, among their peers, to say, we'd really like you to be doing this better. And we think that there are some ideas that work in this state that ought to work in that state, and then make recommendations to the DNC to bump up, to bump down, and maybe to make some suggestions officially to some of the parties. And just on the question of diversity, I obviously am supportive and feel very strongly about that. But one of the issues near and dear to my heart, and friend Denich is here from the Ethnic Council, is we've struggled with this issue of the ethnic voters in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, who get short shrift. and have been getting short shrift from this party now for way too long a period of time. We've been wanting a staff person that would do outreach to our communities. Because if you don't win the Irish, Polish, Italian, Eastern, Central European, et cetera, votes in those states, we're gone. And I am not willing to consign the people of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, et cetera, to hell because, you know, our target states are elsewhere. I mean, these have to be priorities. And so I want to make the party responsive in every state to diversity, in the diversity of those states, and the needs in those states to bring people home to the Democratic Party. And when I raise that issue, they say there's no money. We can't do that. And that's where my first instinct of looking at transparency came about. Why can't we hire an ethnic outreach person? Why can't we focus on reaching those voters we've lost? How do we lose Michigan? How do we lose Michigan? How do we lose Ohio and Pennsylvania in the last round? We finally got a governor back, but how did we lose state legislatures? And look at the damage that's been done to working people in those states. Regardless of the presidency, the outcome of the presidency, because we lost state legislatures and the governorship in Wisconsin, we consign these people to a fate that they will not recover from for another decade, if that at all. You know, this is the state of fighting Bob LaFollette, and look where we are right now. You know, I'm not doing it for this. I'm doing it because I think that we really have a challenge here about state parties, about state organizing, about building up our party in states all across the country, and diversity as it is all across the country, to make this party the vibrant party that we hope it will be and that will win in 18 and 20. And that's what motivates me and I think our group to look at ways that we can create the real reforms we need to do to move forward.
Jim, I don't disagree, but I don't want to lose the point on the contracting piece. That's a whole separate piece. Okay.
And I want to say that ethnic voters are not looking for
Right.
contracts.
No.
And that's not an issue here. It's an issue of looking at the range of diversity.
There are a lot of women in minority firms that are looking for contracts that have been denied that opportunity before by this party.
I've been in the meetings where the caucus chairs have met and have met with various chairs. And that's one of the reasons why the transparency mechanism that I propose is so absolutely vital. It can't just be a one-off meeting, we'll get more contracts, or even hire a diversity team to do it. There needs to be a full transparency to this process so that we have a sense of where this is going, what's doing, and we sit down and have a rational conversation among ourselves about how to make these contracts more diverse. And I agree with you completely on that.
Also, just to clarify, making sure that when we are going for diverse contracts, it's not just for, you know what, you're an African-American firm, you get the African-American work. People can do all types of work. So making sure that it's broader than that, and that when we're called to the table, it's not just to talk about Latinos, it's not just to talk about African-Americans.
Right.
Listen, let me tell you what the Arab guy says about that. Because that's the situation I get thrown in all the time. I completely understand that. If you go talk to your folks, that's the only crowd I get to talk to. And I understand it sucks. And we're bigger than that. All of us are more than that, and all of us have the capacity of being real leaders of a broad segment of the American public, but we don't have that opportunity, and we will not be empowered to do that unless this party becomes more accountable, more transparent, and more democratic. And that's what these proposals are about.
Naomi. Let me just recognize Basil Smikle, Executive Director of the New York Democratic Party, just walked into the room. Just wanted to give him a shout out. We've been talking about New York a lot. Yeah. So I am so inspired by the progress we've made in this room. A lot of this stuff has been debated to death. And I think the last few hours before this meeting and during this meeting have been incredibly productive. And one thing I want to reinforce is we went from being a party that, as Jim says all the time, provided services to communities, whether a neighborhood to the presidency, to sadly becoming a presidential committee. And, you know, we need to win the presidency, right? We didn't, but we need to win the presidency. But that does not necessarily mean, in my opinion, that all of our resources get spent on the presidency. And some of those resources you know, I think it was Jane mentioned maybe putting 30% into state parties. Correct me if I'm wrong. That off time, just to reinforce what we all know here, investing in those state parties, investing in the caucuses, meaning the councils, investing in those programs is investing in the presidency. It's investing in the next generation of leadership. When you take your money, and you know where your money's spent, and when you take that money that you're raising, and you're getting all these finance chairs to go out there around the country and raise money from these big donors, and you're investing them into state parties, and you're investing them into these councils, you're fighting the legislative battles that we're, you know, when we're talking about this electoral reform, that's a legislative issue. And so it is incredibly important that we move from being a nationalized party to becoming a local party again that connects nationally. You know, we are all here representing our states, technically. And our states are starving of resources. Young people are not signing up for the Democratic Party even though the majority are progressive. That's an injustice. That's something that we have to deal with. And so Yvette, you know, you made a really strong point about state party chairs, but some states, there needs to be some sort of, as Jim said, a mechanism to oversee and to make sure that the money is being allocated properly, that we incentivize them properly. Not all chairs are the same. Doing these hearings across the country, not just to hear from state party chairs, but to hear from the activists on the ground, you know, the Democrats who don't feel connected to their party. Why is it they don't? Because sometimes we get in our bubbles. You know, every state's different, obviously, but every state is different. And we need to learn because you know, the consultants can't just swoop into Texas and say, we know how to turn Texas blue, when there are people on the ground in Texas who've been trying to turn it blue for over a decade, and they know better. So I just, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Okay.
When you talk about, you know, looking at how the money is handled, state parties aren't completely and totally and 100% funded by the DNC. Let's be real clear about that. We do call time, and we raise money, you know, in other ways. I just want to be clear about that it's not, you know, we're not being subsidized by the DNC. I just want to be clear about that. We do take care of ourselves.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, I think that was a really healthy discussion. I just want to add, for my parting thoughts on the party reform piece, I think everything that we suggest, and you know, we've talked a lot about really important things and principles we all agree on, has to ultimately be able to be directly connected, in my mind, to winning elections, building the pipeline, and breaking down barriers that people feel to be part of our party. So I ask all of us to make sure that we're looking through that lens, but I also want us to go a step further and actually be able to say how that's going to do that, because I think at the end of the day, where we started this is where we're going to end this discussion, and that we have to win elections, and we have no choice, because if we don't, I don't want to imagine the world that we're going to be living in. So that's my final piece on party reform. So, you know, I am just, always in full admiration of the commission members and their expertise, but their passion and commitment to this party, to unity and to reform. And you know, as Nomi pointed out, these aren't easy discussions. These aren't easy changes. They're not going to be for the national party. They're not going to be for state parties, but they're necessary. And I think that these deliberations and discussions have been very, very valuable. Hopefully, those of you that have joined us and those that will watch when they're at home and they want to catch up on what the Unity Commission is doing will feel the same. But one of the things that I think is most important to remind everyone is that, as you see today, there's a lot still to be done before we end up with a full report of the Unity Commission and the recommendations that we make. There is more input that we're gathering. There's more discussions that we need to have, and frankly, there's more answers that we need to figure out in some instances that we don't know what the path forward is. So again, I just encourage everyone that has opinions and thoughts on this to share that and share with us. So I'm going to close up formally the meeting, but first I wanted to go to the Vice Chair for his thoughts.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody who's been here today, and look forward to talking to people individually. We have a bunch of time, and then look forward also to our small groups of the 21 of us gathering together, since we won't see each other until the last meeting in December. Obviously, we'll have a lot of phone calls. Let me just say that I'm very encouraged by today, and I can imagine more than a year ago building a Democratic Party that is a popular party, a more popular party, not just meaning more popular, but more popular involvement, where new voters, new Democrats can come in and envision how they can help lead the party in the state where they live. Imagine that they or people like them, working people, can run for office, and imagine that this party, leads the way on voting rights and leads the way on big money out of politics. I think that all 21 of us, regardless of how we got here, are sort of looking through the same windshield rather than just the rearview mirror of what got us here, because we got here coming from one of 3 places. But now that we're here, it feels to me more and more like we can see that we need a party that has this popular mass base, not just a party that adapted to Citizens United by looking for big donors, and the big donors then run things. The big donors in our party need to get used to the idea that for us to win, we need to overwhelmingly be a people's party. And I think that I think that this group of 21 people has really learned an enormous amount, or I have learned an enormous amount from everyone here about that, about listening more than talking, and through listening to you, actually have a lot more faith that what we end up with is going to be something that all 21 of us are proud of, and that, as Senator Turner said earlier, that this is the Reform Commission, and those reforms will unify us. And I think we're all committed to that. And Chair, thanks for your leadership.
Thanks, Larry. Okay. As we close out, a few things that I just want to highlight again. So first, as a reminder, the commission members will be sticking around for the next 30 minutes or so, and we would love to talk to anyone who wants to talk about what we've gone through today or in general. So please feel free to stick around and have those conversations. In addition to that, Friday you'll have Unity Commission members represented in the exhibit hall. Please feel free to stop by and also maybe say hello in case nobody's talking to them. And then finally, don't forget to go to the website and fill in your opinions and thoughts there, especially coming out of today's meeting. We take that feedback very seriously. We have from the very beginning when we started this process, and we'll continue to do so as we build a report. Second, I want to just take a moment to say thank yous to everyone here at Bally's Hotel and the staff and the great work that they've done to take care of not just our work, but ASDC and the DNC meetings and making sure we're all in a good place. So thank you in particular to the DNC staff who work tirelessly, do not get the thanks and appreciation that they deserve. Thank you to the IT crew who helped make sure we were Skyping in appropriately and that everyone could hear us, and that went very well. You never know how that's going to go. And to the court reporter as well. So it takes a small army to pull these pieces together, and we are grateful for their work and want to make sure everyone knows what a wonderful team supports the work that we do. I want to also call attention to everyone based on Mayor Webb's recommendation, and a great one at that we as a commission are going to be putting out a statement today that we will share with everyone, but really talks about what happened here in Las Vegas, recognizes what's going on in California, what's continuing to go on in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and really is the more important pieces of what's happening in this world, and we want to make sure that that doesn't get lost inside of these pieces of work that we're doing here today.
Good.
Do you want to add anything to that, Mayor?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, wonderful. And then finally, for commission members, let me get my info here. Okay, our next meeting, the final meeting of the Unity Reform Commission, is going to be in Washington, D.C. on December 8th and 9th. Be there or be square.
Just be there.
Right. That was just a saying.
I know.
So we will follow up on logistics for that. As usual, please leave your binders and they will be taken care of. We obviously encourage everyone who is interested in attending to attend, and we'll have more details about location for that. After folks are going to stay here, we are going to rejoin at 5 o'clock in the same place we were before. We will feed you, but you need to be there. And we appreciate you all. And we thank you for your work. Again, I just want to remind everyone that it is not just the public hearings that the commission members spend time on, but several meetings and calls throughout in between these meetings, and really spending thoughtful time deliberating these issues. So, we are certainly indebted for their commitment and for their minds and the work that they've been doing. So thank you all to the commission. So with that, I would like to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the Unity Reform Commission is adjourned.